Hey there, everybody. It's Professor Malat here with your Week 9 reading overviews. I'm going to share my screen here in a second. I usually share the screen before I start recording, so I don't have to hesitate. But here we are in the Week 9 overview. So this will tell you all the things that you're responsible for doing this week. We're primarily concerned with this week's readings, not that they're difficult or anything like that, but sometimes it's helpful to get a little bit of background so that you can understand what we are going for this week. This week, we are focusing on Lexis, which, if you remember the criteria from John Swales, is essentially the lingo, right? The language that is spoken within a community. Sometimes the people who are outside of a community don't really understand the lingo. You can also think of it as jargon, right? So I have a number of students this summer who are in law or paralegal studies. And so you use certain terms that you're all familiar with, but which people outside of that community might not be as familiar with, or we only have a very basic understanding of those terms. So that's what I'm getting at with Lexis and jargon, or the lingo of the community. So this week we have a few readings. One is Perri Klass, Learning the Language, which is, I think, it's a short reading, very relatable, and I think you as students will understand some of what Klass was talking about as a medical student. The second one is just an article or a chapter from the English Composition 2 web book called Academic Communities. I do have some supplementary or optional materials this week. We have one on discourse communities, just to jog your memory about discourse community. And if you want to, this again is not required because it is a lengthy piece, but there is an article by Elizabeth Wardle, who is a professor of English up at Miami University and co-author of the book Writing About Writing, which is where I'm pulling a lot of these ideas from. And that article is Identity, Authority, and Learning to Write in New Workplaces. So not only do you need to navigate learning to write within your own little discourse communities as students, whether you're law, health professionals, sports administration, whatever your major might be, you all have these little different discourse communities. And oftentimes you're in several different discourse communities. But again, once you're out into the world, right, you also have to navigate and learn how to write in your new workplace. What are the conventions that are expected of you? What type of language do you need to know? What type of language are you expected to use? That kind of thing. So it's interesting, but it's long. So I get it if you don't want to take a look at it. If you're somebody who enjoys reading and you want to read a little bit more, it's a really, really good article. But again, it is very long. And because of the shortened nature of this summer term, I'm not requiring it of you. So let's get into it. I will pull up the PowerPoint on my computer. So excuse me if you actually see all of this on your screen. I apologize. I really should have had the PowerPoint up there to begin with. So here we are, understanding Lexis. I get the file open and we can pop through these slides. So again, this is for week 9. And we're taking a look first at academic communities. Of course, this is a pretty easy overview. And I think most of you will relate to a lot of what they're talking about in this website. But some things to remember: that academic discourse communities involve people like scholars and researchers, instructors, that kind of thing. And we all share common goals in how we communicate. We use specialized language, in this class and of course in other classes. And there are particular conventions that are expected of you. And of course, within the academic discourse community, the goal is the pursuit, exchange, and validation of knowledge. So the reading that this article pulls mostly from is from somebody by the last name of Thani. And that academic discourse communities have 6 defining characteristics. They're building on previous scholarship, using evidence-based claims, acknowledging limitations within their research. They're having clear organization and structure for academic writing. We're, in academic discourse communities, use formal tone and style, and they engage with a scholarly audience that are already familiar with those conventions that they use in their writing. And one thing to keep in mind here is that even though academic communities share traits with other groups, such as shared goals or communication styles, they're unique in their emphasis on evidence, on citation, and of course on the critical engagement with existing knowledge. So we're often looking back to what other scholars and researchers have said about a certain topic, and we're using that as evidence, and we are citing them, right? We use those conventions of citation, and we have, at the end, a list of references. We might call it works cited, we might call it a bibliography, we might call it references, depending on what is expected, what the convention is within your field of study, right? So we have different citation methods. We have MLA, which most of you are really familiar with. But if you are outside of the humanities, you might be expected to use APA, which is the American Psychological Association, or Chicago style formatting and citations. And of course, there are many, many others. There's Harvard, there's the American Medical Association, for those of you who might be going into medicine, and they all have slight variations. They all do the same thing, right? The purpose of those citations are exactly the same, to let the readers know where they can find that information that the writer has used as evidence, and is engaging with critically, right? But it looks slightly different depending on the field that you're in. So that's one example of the conventions used within the field. It's something that you're familiar with, and those who are a part of that group will have certain expectations. So some of the take-home points here, again, to remember that academic communities are built around shared goals and specialized communication. You use certain types of jargon, certain types of Lexis, certain conventions, so on and so forth. Another key thing here to remember is that academic writing, of course, as you know, is structured, formal, and evidence-driven. And that is something that we have been getting into both with the genre analysis assignments and this new discourse community project, where you will really start to dig in and do a lot of research. In the academic community, writers must acknowledge their limitations and also justify the relevance, right? So good academic writing doesn't only present the claims, but it also recognizes its scope. It explains why the topic matters. So you're not just citing somebody and leaving it, you're engaging with that information, and you are kind of tying things together for other readers, while also putting your own personal spin on things, right? And kind of dipping your oar into the water. Lastly, academic discourse differs from everyday communications, no duh, right? Because there's such an emphasis on critical thinking, there's an emphasis on objectivity, and of course, the emphasis on engaging with existing scholarship. So it's not just in the realm of personal opinion, or we're not just using a really casual tone. So I know that some of you prefer to write in a very casual way, a very conversational way, and while that can be good for personal narratives, when we are doing more academic writing, you need to start thinking, okay, this needs to be a little bit more formal, not only because I am your primary audience, but also because other people might actually read it. There are several of you who have written really good analysis papers, and I've asked for permission to use those in future classes. And you have seen, I've pulled from my previous class several very good, very solid student examples, so that you can see what is expected, what are the conventions, what's the type of language that we're looking for in this level of intermediate composition. So that is the academic communities reading. And then the key reading is Perri Klass's Learning the Language. So this actually comes from a book that Klass wrote back in it was published in 1987. I think it was originally published in another journal in 1984, but it was actually included as part of Klass's book, a not entirely benign procedure, 4 years as a medical student. So this reading, you can see how Klass actually applies Swale's criteria of Lexis through her experience as a medical student, kind of navigating her way into the medical discourse community. And one thing that I think will really come across to you in this reading is that there is a shared language which helps to build the social relationships within a community, but excuse me, specifically in the medical discourse community, it also kind of enforces this kind of emotional distance between medical personnel and patients and their families. And if you've ever had any kind of encounter with the medical community, maybe going to your doctor or going into the emergency room or going in and supporting a family member through a procedure, that medical people use a certain kind of terminology so they aren't as, and it seems to be so that they can distance themselves emotionally. And if you think about it, and I think Perri Klass talks about this in the article, if you think about it from the perspective of medical personnel who are dealing with oftentimes very catastrophic and very emotionally grueling things, if you get emotionally connected to the patients, it is an incredible drain, psychologically and emotionally. So I think intentionally they do use a certain type of language and a certain approach in order to enforce some kind of an emotional distance between the doctor and the patient, or between medical personnel and patients. So a key quote that I pulled from this reading is, and I think that demonstrates kind of what Perri was going through in their navigation into the medical discourse community. This special language, right, the Lexis, the jargon that's being used in the medical community, contributes to a sense of closeness and professional spirit among the people who are under a great deal of stress. As a medical student, I found it exciting to discover that I finally cracked the code, that I could understand what doctors said and wrote and could use the same formulations myself. And I'm sure many of you, especially if you are a junior or a senior, you have probably cracked the code for yourselves in your major or in the field that you are entering into, right? You are starting to navigate through that discourse community. You're learning the language, you know what's expected of you. And again, I'm going to pull up the example of those of you who are in pre-law or paralegal studies, that you know that there are certain expectations in the way that you have to write things, and the language that you have to use, right? And so you're kind of navigating your way into that community. And it can sometimes be difficult to switch between communities. I have different expectations for my students as an English professor versus your law professors, right? Or your paralegal studies professors. And so it can be difficult sometimes to switch back and forth and meet those expectations and use the different conventions that are expected of you in the various fields. So that's class. Again, that's a short reading. I think it's just about 3 pages. So it's a quick read, and it's a good one that I think students can relate to. So the take-home points for this one: particular communities, for example, doctors working in a hospital, develop specialized language in order to get things done, right? So you have to remember back to Swale's criteria that the whole purpose of a discourse community is to achieve a certain purpose, and that they use specialized language. And that language can construct identities of the people who use it and the relationships with the people who hear it. So if you are outside of that community, you're going to feel a little bit of distance, right? You aren't one of us. so to speak, right? But also when medical personnel are, in this case, communicating with one another, they can use shorthand, they can use abbreviations, they can say things in a particular way that might seem cold to an outsider, but it eases the communication in order to achieve the goal, right? Or get things done. Moving from outsider to insider status in a particular community often means losing or at least shifting identities. And I'm sure this is something that you have been going through as you move through your college years, right? You were first an outsider, and now you are switching to the insider status, perhaps in your particular field or just in general as part of the academic discourse community. And sometimes that means kind of losing your previous identity or shifting it a little bit, right? It changes you. It changes you. For good or bad, I don't know, right? But it does change you. Um, and, that's just part of growing and experiencing the world more, right? So those are the two readings that I hope you will gain some stuff from, some good information and some understanding of the various aspects of discourse community. So Lexis is what we are focusing on this week. If you have any questions, you know how to you know how to reach me. Take care and have a great week, everybody. Bye-bye.